The first time I buried my brother, I cried until my throat bled. The second time, I didn't cry at all, because he was watching me from inside the grave. And the worst part is, he didn't ask me to stop.
Welcome to Horror Audiobook.
This is not a story about grief. This is a story about what comes after grief, when the dead refuse to stay finished, and love turns into obligation. When my brother came back, he looked the same, sounded the same, and remembered everything, except the part where he was supposed to be gone. What followed was not a haunting, not possession, not madness, but a slow, deliberate negotiation with something that wore my brother's face and watched me decide how far I was willing to go to make it stop. This is the story of the two burials, and why the second one had to be deeper. Chapter 1. My brother died the right way. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and warm plastic, the kind of smell designed to erase individuality. Every room shared it. Every hallway carried it. It was meant to make death feel procedural, manageable, something that could be handled if enough forms were signed and enough machines were unplugged in the correct order. Evan died at 3:17 a.m. The clock on the wall confirmed it. So did the nurse with the tired eyes. So did the doctor who spoke softly, as if volume alone might be the difference between grief and acceptance. They said his name twice, carefully, like repetition could soften the impact. Then they stopped talking and waited for the sound they expected, crying, pleading, denial. None of that happened, not yet. Evan lay still in the bed, his chest no longer rising, his mouth slightly open as if he had been interrupted mid-thought. The machines beside him had been silenced one by one, each beep erased until the room was left with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights. His skin already looked different. Not cold, not gray, just unfamiliar, as though whatever made him him had quietly stepped out while no one was looking. Death did everything it was supposed to do. That phrase would come later. At the time there were only steps, processes. The nurse closed his eyes, the doctor adjusted the sheet, a clipboard appeared, a pen was offered, sign here, initial there, time of death confirmed. Outside the room the hospital continued without hesitation. Wheels squeaked, doors opened and closed. Someone laughed softly down the hall. Life did not pause out of respect. It never did. By sunrise, Evan had been moved to a colder room. By noon, his body had been transferred to a facility with no windows and no sense of urgency. The funeral director spoke in a tone reserved for people who believed professionalism was a form of kindness. He explained options. He explained costs. He explained how long things would take. Everything had a timeline. Everything was under control. Death did everything it was supposed to do. The embalming room was not shown, but it was described. Clean, respectful, efficient. Evan's body was washed, dressed, prepared. His injuries, internal, catastrophic, were hidden beneath a suit he had worn only once before. Makeup softened the sharp edges. His hands were folded carefully, fingers interlaced as if he had chosen the position himself. By the time anyone saw him again, he looked peaceful, almost convincing. The viewing was held 2 days later in a chapel that smelled faintly of old wood and lilies. The casket sat at the front, open, lit just enough to guide the eye but not enough to invite scrutiny. People approached in pairs or alone, pausing for the same respectful interval before moving on. They whispered the same phrases. "He looks like himself. At least he isn't suffering anymore. I'm so sorry for your loss." No one questioned the reality of what they were seeing. The body matched the name. The face matched the memories. The stillness matched expectation. Death did everything it was supposed to do. Evan's brother, Daniel, stood near the front, accepting condolences with the practiced nod of someone who understood his role. His black suit itched at the collar. His shoes were too tight. He felt strangely detached from his own hands, which shook only when he wasn't looking at them. He watched the casket more than the people. There was comfort in its solidity, the weight of it, the certainty that whatever lay inside was contained, defined, finished. Wood, metal, padding, screws, so many layers between Evan and the world. At the funeral, the lid was closed. The sound it made, a dull, final thud, settled into the room like punctuation, a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to reread. The minister spoke of endings and continuations, of souls and rest, but Daniel focused on the casket itself, on the way it refused to move unless several men lifted it together, on the way gravity still applied. Outside, the sky was overcast but dry. The procession moved slowly, a line of vehicles obeying traffic laws out of habit rather than necessity. At the cemetery, the grave had already been dug, straight edges, proper depth. The earth piled neatly beside it, waiting. The casket was lowered with ropes. The motion was steady, controlled, almost gentle. When it reached the bottom, it fit perfectly. No resistance, no shifting, as if the ground had been expecting it. A handful of dirt was offered. Daniel took it without thinking. The soil was cool and granular, darker than he expected. He let it fall, watching it scatter across the polished surface below. That was when it felt real. Not emotional, not overwhelming, just real. Death did everything it was supposed to do. The grave was filled. The mound was shaped. A temporary marker was placed at the head, stamped with Evan's name and dates that now felt obscene in their brevity. People lingered, then dispersed, drawn back to their lives by invisible strings. By evening, the cemetery was empty. By nightfall, the ground had settled. Daniel returned home alone to a house that still smelled like Evan's cologne and laundry detergent. Shoes sat by the door that would never be worn again. A coffee mug rested in the sink, abandoned mid-routine, the ordinary remnants of a life interrupted. He told himself this was the hardest part, the silence, the adjustment, the long, slow process of absence. He told himself that everything had happened correctly. The hospital, the paperwork, the body, the burial. There were no mistakes, no unanswered questions, no loose ends. Death did everything it was supposed to do. And because of that, because everything had been done right, Daniel never considered the possibility that it wasn't finished. Chapter 2. He came back without asking. 3 days passed before Daniel noticed. The house had stopped sounding empty. It wasn't sudden. There was no bang, no shattering moment where reality split open and revealed its teeth. The change crept in the way mold does, quiet, patient, thriving in places no one thinks to check. At first, it was the air. The house no longer felt stale, not fresh either, just occupied, warmed by breath, the kind of atmosphere that settles when someone has been moving through rooms recently, even if they aren't there anymore. Daniel dismissed it as memory. Grief had a way of filling space with ghosts that behaved convincingly enough to ignore. Then came the footsteps. They were soft, almost polite, arriving late at night when exhaustion made everything feel unreliable. A single creak on the staircase, a faint shift of weight in the hallway, sounds the house had always made, but now they came with timing, with intention. Daniel told himself the house was settling, told himself old wood remembered being used and sometimes pretended. On the fourth night, he woke to the sound of breathing. It came from the other side of the bedroom door. Slow, measured, too steady to belong to someone asleep. Daniel lay still, counting his own breaths to prove they were separate from the sound he was hearing. His heart tried to speed up, but fear pressed down on it, heavy and deliberate, as if something wanted him calm. After a while, he never knew how long the breathing stopped. Morning came without incident. Sunlight filled the kitchen. Coffee brewed. The world resumed its familiar rhythm, embarrassed by the idea it had ever faltered. Daniel stood at the sink, staring out the window, waiting for his reflection to blink out of sync with him. It didn't. He laughed once quietly, and the sound felt wrong in his throat. That afternoon, Daniel found Evan sitting at the kitchen table. Not standing, not looming, just sitting, elbows resting on the wood, hands folded loosely together. He wore the same gray jacket he'd been buried in, the fabric unwrinkled, clean, as if the ground had politely declined to stain it. Evan looked up when Daniel entered the room. His eyes locked on immediately, too immediately. "Hey," Evan said. No confusion, no hesitation, no relief. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, keys slipping from his fingers to the floor. The sound didn't make Evan flinch. You're," Daniel began, then stopped. Evan tilted his head slightly, a gesture so familiar it almost hurt. "Home," he finished. His voice was right, same cadence, same quiet steadiness, but it lacked something, an undertone Daniel couldn't name. Like a recording played back at the wrong speed, close enough to fool anyone who wasn't listening carefully. "How?" Daniel asked. Evan shrugged. The motion was minimal, contained. "I walked." That should have been impossible. That should have been enough to break the moment open, to send Daniel running or screaming or collapsing to the floor. Instead, he nodded. "Okay," Daniel said. Evan smiled. It was the wrong kind of smile. The muscles moved, the mouth curved, but nothing reached his eyes. They stayed fixed, unblinking, studying Daniel with an intensity that made his skin prickle. He wasn't angry. He wasn't grateful. He was waiting. They sat in silence for several minutes. Daniel noticed details he didn't want to notice. Evan's chest rose and fell, but too slowly. Once every 10 seconds, maybe more. When he blinked, both eyes closed at exactly the same time, lingered a fraction longer than necessary. "You hungry?" Daniel asked. Evan shook his head. "I don't think so." "Thirsty?" "No." "You tired?" Evan considered this. "I don't think that applies." Daniel laughed again, sharp and short. "Right, of course." He moved through the kitchen on autopilot, opening cabinets, touching objects just to prove they were solid. Evan's gaze followed him continuously, head turning with precise increments, like a camera mounted on a rail. "Did you come back for something?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice casual. Evan didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the doorway, then back to Daniel. "I came back because you were still here." The words settled uncomfortably between them. That night, Evan stood in the doorway of Daniel's bedroom. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared, framed by darkness, hands resting at his sides like a child waiting to be acknowledged. "You can sleep," Evan said. "I'll be right here." "I'd rather you didn't," Daniel replied. Evan nodded. "Okay." He didn't move. Minutes passed. Daniel lay rigid beneath the covers, listening to that slow, measured breathing from across the room. It never changed rhythm, never deepened, never faltered. Eventually, exhaustion won. When Daniel woke, the doorway was empty. The days that followed blurred together. Evan never left the house. He didn't watch television. He didn't read. He spent hours standing in rooms Daniel wasn't in, facing corners, windows, blank walls. When Daniel asked what he was doing, Evan answered honestly. "Listening." "To what?" "Whatever comes next." The house felt smaller now. Hallways seemed longer. Doors closed on their own more often, though there was no wind. At night, Daniel dreamed of dirt pressing against his chest, of weight and patience and time. Sometimes he woke to find Evan sitting at the foot of the bed, watching his face as if memorizing it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't grateful. He was waiting. On the 7th night, Daniel asked the question he had been avoiding. "Do you remember dying?" Evan smiled again, that empty, careful smile. "Yes," he said. "That's how I knew where to come back." Daniel's breath caught, Come back from where? Evan's eyes flicked briefly toward the floor, toward the ground beneath the house. Here, he said, eventually. Daniel understood then, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the shape of what was coming. Evan hadn't returned by mistake. He had returned on purpose. And whatever had followed him home was in no hurry at all. Chapter 3. I pretended this was normal. Normal is a fragile thing. It survives not because it is strong, but because people agree to protect it. Daniel protected it fiercely. The morning after Evan's return, he made breakfast for two. Eggs cracked against the side of the bowl with familiar precision. Bread slid into the toaster. Coffee filled the kitchen with a bitter, comforting smell. These were actions he had performed 1,000 times before, and muscle memory carried him through them now, smoothing over the impossible fact that Evan sat at the table, watching every movement. You always overcook the eggs, Evan said. Daniel smiled despite himself. You always complained. Evan nodded. Some things shouldn't change. They ate together in silence. Evan chewed slowly, methodically, as if following instructions rather than hunger. He swallowed without drinking. Daniel noticed, but did not comment, that Evan never reached for the salt. As long as I didn't ask questions, he didn't answer them. That became the rule, unspoken but absolute. Daniel went back to work the following week. He told his supervisor he was ready, that routine would help. He left Evan alone in the house for hours at a time, convincing himself that if something were truly wrong, it would reveal itself in his absence. Nothing did. When Daniel returned each evening, Evan was always exactly where he had left him, sitting in the living room, standing in the hallway, occasionally in Evan's old bedroom, staring at the wall where posters had once been taped and removed, leaving pale outlines like ghosts of interests long abandoned. How was work? Evan would ask. Fine, Daniel would answer. Neither of them elaborated. They talked about safe things, childhood memories, movies they had both seen years ago. Evan remembered everything with unsettling accuracy, names, dates, exact phrasing. But his responses lagged by a second or two, as if the information had to travel a longer distance to reach him. When Daniel laughed, Evan waited, then smiled. When Daniel frowned, Evan tilted his head, studying the expression like a new language. At night, Daniel slept with the door closed. Most nights, anyway. Sometimes he woke to find it open, the hallway light on, Evan standing just outside the threshold. He never crossed it. He never had to. I was checking, Evan would say. For what? That you were still here. Daniel accepted that explanation far more easily than he should have. As long as I didn't ask questions, he didn't answer them. Days passed, then weeks. The house adjusted around Evan's presence. Floorboards no longer creaked under his weight. Light bulbs dimmed slightly when he entered a room. The air grew colder in spaces he occupied for too long, as if warmth were something the house rationed carefully now. Daniel stopped inviting people over. He declined phone calls. He told himself he needed privacy, time to heal. The truth, that Evan didn't like interruptions, was easier not to examine. Once Daniel brought home takeout. He set a container in front of Evan and watched as his brother poked at the food with a fork, nudging pieces aside. You don't have to pretend, Daniel said gently. Evan looked up. Pretend what? That you're hungry. Evan considered this. I don't think I am pretending. The word settled wrong. Daniel changed the subject. They watched television together, though Evan never blinked at the screen. His attention drifted elsewhere, toward corners of the room, toward spaces where shadows gathered more thickly than they should have. Do you hear that? Evan asked once. Daniel paused the show. Hear what? Evan listened for several seconds. Never mind, it stopped. As long as I didn't ask questions, he didn't answer them. But questions had a way of forming on their own. Daniel began to notice that Evan never slept. He would stand motionless for hours, eyes open, breathing slow and shallow. When Daniel asked about it, carefully, casually, Evan smiled. "I already did that," he said. "Did what?" "Slept." Another rule formed after that: do not ask about before. Still, some things slipped through. One afternoon, Daniel came home early and found Evan in the backyard, standing barefoot in the grass despite the cold. His feet were muddy, but the dirt clung to him strangely, as if reluctant to let go. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked. Evan didn't turn around, listening to the ground. Daniel forced a laugh. "You always were weird." Evan nodded. "You should hear it when it's quiet." That night, Daniel dreamed of roots winding around bones, of soil breathing slowly in the dark. He woke with dirt under his fingernails. He scrubbed his hands raw in the bathroom sink, telling himself it was stress, sleepwalking, grief finding new shapes. Evan watched from the doorway, head tilted. "I can help you with that," he said. "With what?" Not noticing. Daniel turned off the light. "As long as I didn't ask questions, he didn't answer them." The phrase became a comfort, a spell, a way to keep the edges of reality from fraying too quickly. Daniel convinced himself that this, whatever this was, could be managed, that love, habit, and denial were enough to anchor a person to the world. He was wrong. On the 23rd day after Evan's return, Daniel found fresh dirt tracked through the hallway. It led from the back door to Evan's bedroom, then stopped abruptly, as if the ground itself had decided that was far enough. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the marks. When he finally looked up, Evan was behind him. "You went out," Daniel said. Evan nodded. "At night?" "Yes." "Why?" Evan's eyes lingered on Daniel's face, searching for something. Permission, perhaps, or readiness. "You told me not to wake you," Evan said, "so I didn't." Daniel swallowed. As long as I didn't ask questions, he didn't answer them. But the house felt different now, heavier, as if something beneath it had shifted, aligning itself more precisely with the rooms above. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he heard scratching, soft, rhythmic, coming from under the floor. And for the first time since Evan's return, Daniel understood that pretending was no longer enough to keep what was coming from finding him. Chapter 4. The house started choosing sides. The house had always been old, but it had never been opinionated. Before Evan returned, it behaved the way houses do, pipes knocking when temperatures changed, floorboards complaining underfoot, doors drifting shut if the air pressure shifted just right. All of it explainable, all of it ignorable. That changed quietly. Daniel noticed it first in the mornings. He would wake with the sense that someone had already moved through the house before him, that the day had begun without his permission. The air in the hallway felt used, warmer near the ceiling, colder near the floor, as if it had been displaced by a body that no longer needed warmth. Evan was always awake. Sometimes he stood at the end of the hall, facing Daniel's bedroom door. Sometimes he sat on the couch, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing. Wherever he was, the room around him felt occupied even when he stepped away, like a chair that stayed warm long after someone stood up. The house remembered him. Doors began to close on their own, but only behind Daniel. He would move from the kitchen to the living room and hear the soft, deliberate click of the latch settling into place. When he turned back, the door would be shut, the knob cold and unyielding. Evan never seemed surprised by it. "Drafty," Daniel muttered once, forcing a laugh. Evan tilted his head. "It's calm in here." Sleep became optional, then impossible. Daniel tried routines: no caffeine afternoon, screens off before bed, white noise humming softly from his phone. None of it mattered. The house would not let him rest for long. Every time he drifted toward sleep, something shifted. A step overhead, a creak directly beneath the bed, the faintest pressure against the walls like hands testing for weak spots. When he checked the rooms, they were empty. Too empty. The longer Daniel stayed awake, the more he noticed patterns. The guest room stayed warmer than the rest of the house, even with the vents closed. Evan spent hours there, standing in the center of the room, breathing slow and shallow. The basement, on the other hand, grew colder by the day. Daniel avoided it instinctively. The door at the top of the stairs seemed heavier now, swollen with moisture that hadn't been there before. When he stood near it, he felt a subtle pull, a pressure in his chest that made breathing feel like work. Once he found the door open. The light was on at the bottom of the stairs, casting long shadows upward. The air that rose from below smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. "Evan," Daniel called. No answer. He shut the door without looking down. The house rewarded him with silence. Isolation crept in sideways. Daniel stopped answering messages. He let calls go to voicemail. When coworkers asked how he was holding up, he said better with enough conviction to end the conversation. It was easier to manage one impossible thing than dozens of concerned voices trying to make sense of it. Besides, Evan didn't like when the phone rang. Each time it did, the lights flickered. Once, a framed photo fell from the wall, the glass shattering at Daniel's feet. Evan watched calmly from across the room. "They don't need to know," he said. "Know what?" Daniel asked. "That I'm here." The house agreed. Mail began arriving late or not at all. The internet dropped out for hours at a time, usually at night. When Daniel tried to leave one afternoon, the car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, coughed, then fell silent. Evan stood on the porch, watching. "Maybe tomorrow," he said. Daniel slammed the hood harder than necessary. The car started immediately after. Inside, the walls creaked in a way that sounded almost pleased. "The house knew which one of us belonged." Daniel repeated that thought without realizing it, the way one might hum a tune under their breath. It explained too much to ignore. Evan moved through rooms without sound now, while Daniel's footsteps echoed too loudly, announcing his presence like a warning. At night, the hallway light turned on by itself. It illuminated the path from Evan's room to Daniel's door, a soft, inviting glow that made the shadows deeper by contrast. Daniel slept in fragments, 10 minutes here, 20 there. Dreams bled into waking moments. He saw movement in mirrors that stopped when he turned. He heard his name spoken softly from inside the walls, always in Evan's voice. Once, in a moment of desperate clarity, Daniel tried to leave for good. He packed a bag, hands shaking, breath coming too fast. He didn't look at Evan as he moved toward the front door. The knob wouldn't turn. Not stuck, refusing. Behind him, Evan spoke gently, "You don't have to go." Daniel pressed his forehead against the door, feeling the solid, unyielding wood. "I do." There was a pause. Then from somewhere deep within the house came a sound like a sigh, long, settling, final. The door opened. Daniel stepped onto the porch, gulping in cold air, heart pounding. He made it 3 steps before the world tilted sharply to the left. The ground rushed up, knocking the breath from his lungs. When he pushed himself upright, he saw what had happened. The porch boards had shifted, not broken, rearranged. A subtle, intentional gap exactly where his foot had landed. Evan stood in the doorway, concern etched carefully onto his face. "You should be more careful," he said. Daniel laughed, a thin, hysterical sound. "You did that." Evan shook his head. The house did. Daniel crawled back inside, without another word. That night the scratching beneath the floor returned, louder now, more insistent. It moved from room to room, following Daniel as he paced, tracing his steps from below. Evan sat calmly in the living room, listening. "The house knows," he said softly. "Knows what?" Daniel whispered. Evan looked at him, eyes steady, unblinking. The house knew which one of us belonged. The scratching stopped directly beneath Daniel's feet. And for the first time, the house felt full, not of memories, not of ghosts, but of allegiance. Chapter 5. He remembered dying too clearly. Daniel learned the details by accident. It happened on a quiet afternoon when the house seemed almost cooperative. Sunlight rested on the living room carpet. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air. Evan sat across from Daniel, hands folded, posture perfect, as if he were waiting for an interview to begin. Daniel hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in days. His thoughts felt loose, poorly secured. He spoke without fully deciding to. "Do you remember what it was like?" he asked. Evan didn't ask him to clarify. "Yes," Evan said. The word landed heavily between them. Daniel swallowed. What do you remember?" Evan leaned back slightly, gaze drifting toward the ceiling. Not unfocused, listening, measuring. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "It was tight first," he said, "everywhere at once, like being held by something that didn't have arms." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. "I couldn't move," Evan continued. "Not because I was restrained, because there was nowhere to move. Space stopped behaving the way it's supposed to." Daniel forced himself to breathe slowly. "You were unconscious," he said. "They said." "I heard them," Evan replied. "Their voices came through like vibrations, not sound, pressure." He turned his head to look directly at Daniel. "You cried louder than you think." Daniel's mouth went dry. Evan went on, unhurried. Time didn't pass evenly. Some moments stretched until they were thin enough to see through. Others collapsed into nothing. I remember being aware of my body long after it stopped working. Daniel stood up abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's enough." Evan watched him carefully. "You asked." Daniel paced the room, hands clenched. "You didn't die like that, you couldn't have. The brain shuts down, memory doesn't." "Stop," Evan finished. "It didn't." The house creaked softly, settling around them. "I remember the cold," Evan said. "Not the absence of heat, the presence of something else, something that replaced it." Daniel pressed his palms against his temples. "Please." Evan nodded once. "Okay." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Daniel focused on mundane details, the pattern in the wallpaper, the faint hum of electricity in the walls, anything to anchor himself. Minutes passed. Then Evan spoke again. "It wasn't empty." Daniel froze. "There were others," Evan said. "Not people, not exactly, more like impressions, places where something had been pressed for a very long time." He paused, brow furrowing slightly, as if recalling something unpleasant. "They noticed me when I noticed them." Daniel turned slowly. "Noticed you how?" Evan smiled faintly. "The way you notice a light turning on in a dark room." The metaphor hit too close. "They were curious," Evan continued. "Not about me, about what I came from." Daniel's voice trembled. "You mean us?" "The house," Evan corrected gently. "You." Daniel laughed weakly. "You're saying death was what? A meeting?" Evan considered this, more like an orientation. Daniel backed toward the wall, every instinct screaming at him to put distance between himself and whatever stood in front of him wearing his brother's face. "You didn't escape," Daniel whispered. Evan's eyes softened, almost apologetic. "No." "Then why are you here?" Evan's gaze flicked briefly toward the floor, toward the basement, toward the ground beneath the house. "I was allowed," he said. Daniel felt something inside him give way, not panic, not grief, but understanding, cold and precise. He didn't come back alive. He came back informed. Daniel slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to his chest. What did they want? Evan hesitated. It was the first time Daniel had seen him do that. They wanted to know how long it takes, Evan said slowly, for someone to agree. Agree to what? Evan met his eyes. To stay. The lights flickered. Daniel shook his head violently. No, no, that's not, this isn't. You're tired, Evan said. They know that, that's why they sent me first. Sent you? Daniel echoed. Evan nodded. I'm proof. Of what? That coming back is possible, Evan said, and that leaving again is optional. The house sighed, a sound like wind moving through soil. Daniel staggered to his feet and fled to the bathroom, retching violently into the sink. Nothing came up but bile. He splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection, sunken eyes, trembling hands, a man being worn down grain by grain. When he returned to the living room, Evan was standing by the window, watching the yard. They don't rush, Evan said quietly. They don't need to. Daniel followed his gaze. The grass outside looked darker than it should have, patches of earth showing through like wounds that refused to heal. What happens if I say no? Daniel asked. Evan turned. His smile was gone. Then they wait, he said, until you stop asking questions. The scratching beneath the floor began again, slow, deliberate, closer than before. Daniel closed his eyes. He had wanted answers. Now he had too many. And none of them suggested that death was the worst thing that could happen to someone who stayed too long in this house. Chapter 6. The second burial was my idea. The idea didn't arrive fully formed. It crept in slowly, disguised as relief. Daniel spent the night after Evan's confession sitting on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, listening to the house breathe. The scratching beneath the floor came and went in cycles, like something packing, testing patience. Evan did not join him. Evan did not need to. By morning, exhaustion had sanded the sharp edges off Daniel's fear. What remained was something quieter, something almost reasonable. Mercy. That was the word he chose. If Evan had come back wrong, if whatever had informed him, shaped him, hollowed him out was still clinging to him, then wasn't it cruel to let that continue? Wasn't it kinder to finish what had already begun? Death done properly had rules. Evan himself had said so without meaning to. He had described interruption, incompletion. Daniel convinced himself he could correct that. The thought settled into place with frightening ease. He didn't tell Evan right away. He needed time to rehearse it in his head, to find the version of the plan that sounded like compassion instead of panic. He cleaned the house instead, scrubbed surfaces, took out trash that hadn't been touched in days. Order helped him think. Evan watched quietly from doorways, his gaze following Daniel with patient interest. "You're busy," Evan observed. "I'm thinking," Daniel replied. "That's good," Evan said. "They like when you think." Daniel flinched but said nothing. That afternoon, Daniel drove to the hardware store. The car started without hesitation, as if eager to be useful again. The parking lot was full of ordinary people doing ordinary things, arguing over paint samples, complaining about prices, laughing. Daniel moved through the aisles in a daze. He bought a shovel, heavy-duty, reinforced handle. The cashier didn't comment. He bought gloves, thick ones. He bought plastic sheeting. On the drive home, Daniel told himself he was preparing for the worst, not committing to it. Contingency planning, that was all. Evan was standing in the backyard when Daniel returned, staring at the same patch of ground he had listened to before. "I was wondering when you'd go," Evan said. Daniel set the bags down slowly. "You knew." Evan nodded. "You were getting close." "Close to what?" "To understanding," Evan said. Then, after a pause, "and to being very tired." They sat together on the back steps as the sun dipped low, painting the yard in long shadows. The air smelled of damp soil and cut grass. The house loomed behind them, silent but attentive. "I think you're in pain," Daniel said finally. Evan looked at him. I don't feel pain the way you do. That's not what I mean, Daniel said. I mean, whatever you brought back with you, whatever you're carrying, it's not fair to you. Evan studied Daniel's face, searching. You want to put me back, he said. Daniel swallowed. I want to let you rest. Evan considered this. Rest is a direction, not a place. Daniel clenched his fists. You said yourself you didn't escape, that you were allowed back. That means it can be undone. Yes, Evan agreed. Daniel's breath hitched. You'll help me then. Evan smiled softly. Of course, he said, if that's what you need. He let me do it. They waited until night. The house seemed calmer than it had been in weeks, as if satisfied by the decision. The scratching beneath the floor stopped entirely. Doors stayed open where Daniel left them. Even the lights behaved. Daniel dressed Evan in clean clothes, the same ones from the funeral, carefully laundered. Evan stood still as Daniel adjusted the collar, smoothed wrinkles that weren't there. You don't have to, Daniel murmured, more to himself than to Evan. I know, Evan said. They walked to the edge of the yard together, shovel in hand. The soil was soft, easier to break than Daniel expected. Each thrust of the shovel released a rich, loamy smell that filled the air and clung to his clothes. Evan watched with interest. You're digging too shallow, he said gently. Daniel paused. How do you know? Evan pointed. They prefer depth. Daniel dug deeper. Sweat ran down his spine despite the cool night. His arms ached. His breath came in ragged bursts. Evan never offered to help. When the hole was deep enough, when it looked wrong, too dark, too final, Daniel stopped. He stared at it for a long time. This won't hurt, Daniel said, voice shaking. It'll be fast. Evan nodded. It always is at first. Daniel closed his eyes. I'm sorry. I know, Evan said. That's why it works. Daniel guided Evan into the hole. There was no struggle, no fear. Evan climbed down carefully, standing at the bottom, looking up with mild curiosity. Are you sure? Daniel asked, desperate now for resistance, for anything that would make this harder to justify. Evan smiled. You already decided. Daniel began to shovel dirt back in. The sound was unbearable, soil striking fabric, filling space that had held a person. Evan didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply watched, eyes visible until the last possible moment. He let me do it. When the hole was filled, Daniel collapsed to his knees, sobbing into his gloves. The yard was silent. The house loomed. For a moment, just a moment, Daniel felt something like peace. Then the ground shifted. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to settle. From beneath the earth, Evan's voice rose, calm and clear. You should go inside now, he said. They don't like to be interrupted. Daniel screamed and ran, slamming the back door behind him. Inside, the house exhaled. The lights dimmed, then steadied. Daniel pressed his back against the door, heart hammering, realization crashing down on him all at once. He hadn't ended anything. He had only shown them how willing he was to try. And somewhere beneath the house, beneath the yard, beneath the rules of how death was supposed to work, something patient adjusted its expectations. Chapter 7. The ground didn't accept him. The yard looked normal the next morning. That was the first lie. Dawn spread a thin, colorless light across the grass, flattening shadows and smoothing over the damage Daniel had done. The disturbed soil lay where he had left it, tamped down, almost tidy. No cracks, no collapse, no sign that anything beneath it had objected. Daniel stood at the kitchen window for a long time, coffee cooling untouched in his hands, waiting for something to change. Nothing did. For a few fragile hours, he believed it had worked. The house was quiet, too quiet, no scratching, no creaking. Even the pipes held their breath. The silence pressed in on him, thick and unnatural, but it was a silence without Evan's presence, and Daniel clung to that distinction like a lifeline. He showered. He changed clothes. He opened windows and let cold air wash through the rooms. The house smelled faintly of soil and detergent, a combination that made his stomach turn. By noon, the silence had grown heavier. Daniel realized then that the house was not empty. It was listening. The first sign came from the mirrors. Daniel noticed it in the hallway bathroom in the narrow strip of glass above the sink. His reflection looked wrong, not distorted, not altered, just delayed. When he raised his hand, the movement lagged by half a second before catching up. Behind him, in the mirror only, Evan stood in the doorway. Daniel spun around. The doorway was empty. He stared back at the mirror. Evan was gone. Only Daniel's own pale face stared back, eyes rimmed red, breath shallow. Some things aren't buried. They're postponed. That night Daniel dreamed of hands pushing up through soil, not grasping, not clawing, testing, feeling for air that wasn't there. He woke with the taste of dirt in his mouth and the impression of weight pressing down on his chest. He checked the yard at dawn. The disturbed earth had shifted again, not much, just enough to suggest movement. The soil looked looser, darker, as if it had been turned from below. Daniel fetched the shovel. He told himself he was just checking, making sure everything was as it should be. The first thrust of the shovel struck something solid almost immediately. Wood. Daniel froze. He dug frantically, heart-pounding, breath coming in sharp bursts. The top of the coffin emerged unmarred, the lid intact. No scratches, no cracks, no sign of struggle. Relief washed through him so powerfully his knees buckled. Then he heard breathing. It didn't come from the coffin. It came from behind him. Daniel turned slowly. Evan stood at the edge of the yard, barefoot, clothes spotless, expression calm. "You weren't supposed to do that yet," Evan said. Daniel screamed, dropping the shovel. How are you?" Evan tilted his head. "I didn't leave. You just changed where you were looking." The ground beneath the coffin shifted again, settling with a soft, wet sound. "Some things aren't buried. They're postponed." Daniel ran back into the house, slamming the door, locking it, pressing his back against the wood like it might dissolve if he didn't hold it together. Inside, the house was awake again. Walls whispered softly, a sound just below the threshold of understanding. Shadows moved independently of light. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation. Evan followed him in without opening the door. He was suddenly there, standing at the end of the hallway, watching Daniel with an expression that might have been concern. "They didn't like it," Evan said. "Who?" Daniel demanded, hysterical. "The ground," Evan replied. "The house, the ones underneath." "You said it would work." Evan shook his head. "I said I would help." Daniel laughed, a broken, brittle sound. "You're still here." Evan nodded. "So are you." That night Evan did not speak. He didn't need to. Daniel saw him everywhere, in reflections, in the corners of rooms, in the way shadows bent toward the center of the house. Sometimes Evan appeared younger, healthier. Sometimes his face looked wrong, features slightly misaligned, as if something were still adjusting its understanding of him. Sleep became impossible. When Daniel closed his eyes, he felt the pressure of earth around him, the sense of being held in place by something vast and patient. He heard Evan's voice not as sound, but as vibration, echoing through his bones. In the kitchen, Daniel found footprints leading from the basement to the back door, muddy and barefoot. He followed them down the stairs despite every instinct screaming at him not to. The basement was warmer now. The concrete floor was damp, darkened in spreading patches that pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly. The air smelled of rust and wet soil. At the far wall, where nothing had been before, There was a narrow crack running from floor to ceiling. Daniel approached it slowly. He could hear movement on the other side, not scratching, not digging, but shifting, adjusting. "You can't put it back the same way," Evan said behind him. Daniel didn't turn. "Then how do I fix this?" There was a pause. "You don't," Evan said. "You finish it." Daniel finally faced him. "Finish what?" Evan smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. "Deciding," he said. The crack in the wall widened slightly, releasing a breath of air that smelled like deep earth and something older. Some things aren't buried. They're postponed. That night, as Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he understood the truth he had been avoiding. The second burial hadn't failed. It had only delayed the inevitable. And whatever was waiting beneath, the house was done being patient. Chapter 8. He started watching instead of speaking. Evan stopped talking on the third night after the ground shifted. Not abruptly, not dramatically, he simply ran out of reasons. Daniel noticed it in fragments, a question left unanswered, a greeting met with a stare. At first, Daniel filled the silence himself, babbling explanations, apologies, justifications no one had asked for. Evan listened. He always listened. He stood in doorways now, never crossing thresholds unless Daniel did first. His eyes followed every movement, tracking with unsettling precision. When Daniel paced, Evan's head turned. When Daniel froze, Evan froze too, mirroring him like a reflection that had learned to anticipate the original. Silence was his way of moving closer. The house adapted quickly. Rooms rearranged themselves subtly overnight. Furniture shifted just enough to interrupt Daniel's paths. Chairs appeared where he didn't remember leaving them. Corners grew darker, swallowing light instead of reflecting it. Evan positioned himself in those corners. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink as often anymore. When he did, it felt like an affectation. Something he remembered was expected, not something he needed. Daniel tried not to look at him. That became impossible. Every reflective surface betrayed him. The microwave door, the television screen, the darkened window at night. Evan was always there in the background, slightly closer than before, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. Judging. Daniel stopped showering with the door closed. He couldn't stand the thought of Evan watching without being seen. At least if the door was open, Daniel could see him too, standing in the hallway, hands folded, head tilted. Waiting. Meals went untouched. Daniel cooked out of habit, then forgot to eat. Evan never joined him at the table anymore. He stood behind Daniel's chair, close enough that Daniel could feel a faint pressure against his back, like a change in air density. Daniel lost track of time. Days blurred. Nights stretched thin and endless. Outside, the world continued, cars passed, neighbors mowed lawns, life went on with cruel indifference. But the house felt sealed off, insulated by something thicker than walls. Daniel tried to leave again. He made it to the front door before the silence pressed in so hard it felt physical, like hands around his throat. His chest tightened. His vision tunneled. Behind him, Evan stood silently. Daniel turned slowly. "Say something," he begged. Evan didn't. Silence was his way of moving closer. Daniel collapsed to the floor, gasping. The pressure eased immediately, as if satisfied. That night, Daniel realized what Evan was doing. He was studying him. Not like a brother, like a process. Daniel noticed patterns. Evan's attention sharpened when Daniel hesitated, when his resolve faltered. When Daniel cried, Evan leaned in closer. When Daniel spoke aloud to himself, trying to reason through his situation, Evan watched his mouth intently, memorizing the shape of doubt. Fear wasn't the lesson. Guilt was. Daniel dreamed of being buried again, not physically but socially. Forgotten, unremembered. In the dream, Evan stood at the edge of the grave, silent, watching as dirt filled Daniel's mouth, his ears, his eyes. When Daniel woke screaming, Evan was sitting on the edge of the bed. Too close. Daniel scrambled backward, hitting the headboard. Get away from me. Evan didn't move. Silence was his way of moving closer. The basement crack widened. Daniel avoided it as long as he could, but the house funneled him there eventually. Hallways shortened. Doors stuck. The air grew colder everywhere except below. When Daniel stood at the top of the basement stairs, Evan appeared beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Almost. Daniel descended alone. The crack in the wall pulsed faintly now, like something breathing just beneath the surface. The smell of earth was stronger, layered with something older, sourer. Daniel pressed his palm against the concrete. It was warm. Behind him, Evan watched. Daniel turned. "You're learning," he said hoarsely. Evan's eyes flickered. "Learning what?" Daniel demanded. Evan said nothing, but his gaze shifted briefly toward Daniel's chest, toward his heart. Silence was his way of moving closer. That was when Daniel understood. Whatever had come back with Evan, whatever had informed him, was not interested in bodies. It was interested in decisions, in the way people surrender without being forced. In the precise moment fear outweighs hope. Daniel backed away slowly. "I won't help you." Evan tilted his head, considering. The house creaked, a sound like disappointment. That night Daniel locked himself in his bedroom. He pushed furniture against the door, wedged a chair under the knob. He sat on the floor, clutching a kitchen knife, every nerve screaming. Hours passed. Then the silence changed. It deepened. The pressure returned, heavier this time, pressing in from all sides. The walls bowed inward just slightly. The ceiling groaned. Daniel screamed for Evan to stop. Nothing. Then from the other side of the door, Evan's hand slid into view beneath the gap. Palm up. Empty. An invitation. Silence was his way of moving closer. Daniel sobbed, curling into himself, refusing to take it. The pressure eased again. The house learned something new that night. So did Evan. And as Daniel lay shaking on the floor, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. Evan no longer needed to speak. He already knew exactly how long Daniel could hold out before silence won. Chapter 9. I learned what he wanted. Daniel stopped thinking in terms of escape. That realization came quietly, without panic. It settled over him one morning as he stood in the kitchen, staring at a sink full of unwashed dishes that no longer bothered him. The house had stripped urgency from everything. Hunger, exhaustion, fear. They still existed, but they had been dulled, rounded off, made manageable. That was how it worked. Evan stood in the doorway, silent as ever. He had taken to that spot recently, half in shadow, half in light, as if practicing how to exist between states. His eyes never left Daniel. "I know now," Daniel said aloud. Evan didn't react. He didn't need to. Daniel dried his hands slowly, deliberately, buying himself time. Speaking felt dangerous, but not speaking felt worse. Silence was no longer neutral. It was a tool Evan wielded with precision. "You don't want to be alive," Daniel continued. "Not really." Evan's head tilted a fraction. Daniel felt a bitter, humorless smile tug at his mouth. "You don't even want me to be alive." Evan blinked. Once. That was confirmation enough. Daniel laughed softly, the sound thin and cracked. "You want me to stay." The house creaked in response, a low sound that vibrated through the walls and into Daniel's bones. Approval, he realized, or anticipation. "You didn't follow me back," Daniel whispered. "You prepared a place for me." The words tasted wrong in his mouth, like a truth his body rejected even as his mind accepted it. Evan finally moved. He stepped into the kitchen, crossing the threshold without hesitation. The air shifted around him, thickening, bending inward. He stood very close to Daniel now, closer than he ever had before. "You understand," Evan said. It was the first time he'd spoken in days. Daniel flinched at the sound of his voice. It felt heavier now, layered, as if something else were speaking just behind it, waiting its turn. "You want company," Daniel said. "Not visitors, not sacrifices, inheritance." Evan smiled, not the hollow, careful smile from before, but something quieter, something satisfied. "They don't like being alone," Evan said, "and neither do you." Daniel shook his head. "That's not true." Evan's gaze flicked around the kitchen, to the empty chair across the table, to the unused plate, to the doorway that had not welcomed another person in weeks. "You stayed," Evan said simply. Daniel had no answer for that. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become unreliable, folding in on itself the longer Daniel remained inside the house. The light outside the windows never seemed to change. The sun hovered in a perpetual late afternoon, shadows stretched but unmoving. Evan led Daniel to the basement. Not by force, by inevitability. The stairs groaned beneath their combined weight. The air grew warmer with each step, thick with the smell of damp earth and rust. The crack in the wall had widened enough now that it no longer looked like damage. It looked like a door. Daniel approached it slowly. The concrete around the Chinese letter was discolored, darkened by moisture that pulsed faintly, rhythmically. "Breathing." "This is where you went," Daniel said. Evan nodded. "This is where I learned how." "How what?" "How to wait." Daniel swallowed. "And if I do?" Evan looked at him then, not with judgment, not with threat, but with something like pity. "Then you'll leave," Evan said, "eventually." "Alive?" Evan hesitated. "That depends," he said, "on how long you can carry what I'm carrying." The crack widened another inch. Air rushed out, warm and stale, carrying whispers that were not quite voices but felt like attention being focused, narrowed, sharpened. Daniel stepped back. "You said coming back was optional." Evan smiled faintly. "Staying is." The choice crystallized then. Not burial or freedom, not death or life. Those were false binaries, distractions. The real choice was simpler. Go alone. Or stay together. Daniel thought of the house, how it had wrapped around Evan, accepted him, learned him. He thought of the way the ground had shifted, the way the walls had leaned inward, the way silence itself had been weaponized. Inheritance. This was not possession, it was succession. "If I stay," Daniel said slowly, "you leave." Evan nodded. "That was always the arrangement." Daniel laughed again, louder this time, a bark of disbelief. "You came back just to hand it off." Evan's eyes softened. "I came back because you would understand." The whispers grew louder, pressing against Daniel's ears inside his skull. He felt them probing, testing, brushing against memories, regrets, unfinished grief. He thought of the first burial, the clean one, the right one. He thought of how death had done everything it was supposed to do, and how that had never been the problem. "You didn't follow me back," Daniel said again, voice barely audible now. "You prepared a place for me." Evan stepped aside, revealing the opening fully. The darkness beyond it was not empty. It was furnished. Waiting. Evan placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, warm, steady, unbearably familiar. "I won't be far," he said, "not anymore." Daniel closed his eyes. Above them, the house settled, beams creaking into a new configuration. Something deep beneath the foundation shifted, making room. The choice was made the moment Daniel realized he had stopped asking how to leave, and started wondering how long Evan had been alone. As Daniel took his first step forward, The crack in the wall widened just enough to let him pass. And behind him, the basement stairs began to seal themselves shut. Chapter 10. The second grave was deeper. The space beneath the house did not feel like a place. It felt like a decision already made. Daniel stepped through the widening crack and into a chamber that should not have existed, too large for the footprint above, too symmetrical for rot or chance. The walls were not dirt or stone, but something compressed, layered, smoothed by patience. They breathed faintly. The air carried the cold of depth and the warmth of something kept alive by attention alone. Behind him, the opening narrowed. Ahead, the chamber opened into a long, shallow descent, like a throat easing itself open. The floor sloped downward, darker with every step, and the whispers, once diffuse, aligned themselves into something almost coherent. Not words, invitations. Evan walked beside him. He did not touch Daniel. He did not need to. His presence pressed against Daniel's thoughts like a thumb against a bruise, reminding him of every reason he had stayed this long. "You don't have to go all the way," Evan said quietly. Daniel stopped. "Neither did you," Daniel replied. Evan smiled, not with relief, not with warmth, but with recognition. "I did." Daniel shook his head. "You went first, that's not the same." They reached the bottom together. The chamber widened again into a hollow that pulsed with dim, amber light like something remembering fire. At its center was a depression in the floor, carefully shaped, reverent, a place meant to be filled. The second grave. Daniel understood then what the house had wanted all along. Not blood, not bodies, continuity. Someone to hold the weight when the last one grew tired. Someone to listen when the whispers became too loud to ignore. Succession. Evan gestured to the hollow. "It will fit you better," he said. Daniel laughed softly. "You practiced that, didn't you?" Evan didn't answer. The whispers swelled, brushing against Daniel's memories, his brother's laugh, the smell of the hospital, the thud of the coffin lid. They offered peace. They offered quiet. They offered the end of asking questions. Daniel closed his eyes. He thought of the first burial, the right one, the clean one, how death had done everything it was supposed to do and how that had never been enough. When he opened his eyes, he was holding the shovel. It shouldn't have been there, it shouldn't have fit through the crack, but it did. Evan noticed it at the same time. "No," Evan said gently, "that's not how this ends." Daniel tightened his grip. "It ends how I decide." The whispers recoiled, not in fear but surprise. Evan stepped closer, hands open, placating. "You don't understand what you're taking on." "I do," Daniel said. "I understand exactly." He stepped past Evan and into the hollow. The ground welcomed him, warm, yielding, eager to be useful again. The walls leaned inward, listening. Daniel raised the shovel and drove it down into the floor with a force that shuddered through the chamber. The first strike hurt everything. The whispers spiked. The amber light flickered. Evan staggered, a hand to his chest, eyes wide. "You can't," Evan began. Daniel struck again. "This isn't a place," Daniel said through clenched teeth. "It's a habit." The third strike split something unseen. The chamber groaned, a sound like a lung collapsing. The whispers lost their rhythm, overlapping, tripping over themselves. Evan cried out, not in pain but in alarm. Daniel turned the shovel on him. Evan backed away for the first time since he'd returned. "If you do this," he said, voice shaking now, "you'll be alone." Daniel advanced. "I already am." He swung. The shovel did not cut flesh. It broke coherence. Evan's shape stuttered, blurred, reassembled wrong. The thing behind his eyes surged forward, furious now, shedding patience. Daniel didn't stop. He struck until the light dimmed, until the whispers fractured into static, until the chamber began to collapse inward, not violently, but decisively, like a body choosing stillness. Evan fell to his knees, gasping, eyes searching Daniel's face. "I tried to make it easier," Evan whispered. "I know," Daniel said. He brought the shovel down one last time. The hollow filled, not with dirt, not with bone, but with silence so complete it rang. The ground cooled rapidly, sealing itself with a finality the first grave had lacked. The walls smoothed. The light went out. The house above shuddered, then settled. Daniel found himself back in the basement, the crack in the wall reduced to a hairline seam. The air was cold again, ordinary. The stairs were open. He climbed them slowly. Morning light spilled into the kitchen. The sink was still full of dishes. The chair still sat empty across the table. The house felt quieter, not listening, not leaning. Daniel stepped into the backyard. The earth was undisturbed. No mound, no mark. He stood there for a long time, waiting for regret to arrive, for grief to claw its way back into his chest. Something did arrive. Responsibility. That night Daniel slept, deeply, dreamlessly. When he woke, the house creaked softly, not in hunger, not in anticipation, but in acknowledgement. He moved through rooms that felt neutral again, unclaimed. Mirrors reflected only him. Mostly. Sometimes, when he paused too long in a doorway, he felt a pressure behind his eyes, a suggestion, not a command, a reminder of what patience could build if left unattended. He learned how to keep the house quiet. He learned where to stand, when to listen, when not to. And on nights when the floor grew warm beneath his feet, and the walls leaned in just a fraction too close, Daniel would whisper the words that held everything in place. "Some things end," he would say. "Some things are finished." The house would listen. And somewhere deep beneath it, beneath the second grave that was deeper than the first, something would settle back into stillness. "I'm still here, but I don't know which of us stayed buried."
Closing chapter.
Some deaths are not endings. They are negotiations. What I learned is this: love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It rots, it waits, it learns how to survive in places it doesn't belong. My brother didn't come back because he was unfinished. He came back because I was. Because grief leaves doors open, and guilt invites things inside that know how to wear familiar faces. So if you ever feel watched by something you loved, if something from your past refuses to stay buried, ask yourself this carefully: are you trying to save it, or are you teaching it how to stay? If this story stayed with you, don't walk away quietly. Listen again. Share it. And remember, some graves are deeper for a reason.